feel very called to become a member of the Catholic Church.
Love the Catholic Church. It's just the best place to be.
From the studios of EWTN, this is Open Line. In North America, call toll-free 1-800-585-9396. That's 1-800-585-9396. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985. You can also send an email to openline@ewtn.com.
Hey, happy Wednesday to each and every one of you. Thanks so much for taking some time out of your busy schedule to join us on Open Line Wednesday. Normally, Father Mitch Pacwa is in the house, but Father Mitch is still recuperating from his cardiac episode, and we have sitting in the chair for Father Mitch, the very capable Colin Donovan, our Vice President of Theology here at EWTN, and aside from about 14 languages, I think Colin could probably cover just about everything else that Father Mitch might want to talk about.
By aside, you mean notwithstanding the inability to speak 14 other languages.
That's right.
Yes.
That's exactly
as long as
what I
we're
mean.
Clear on that.
Clear as mud. 1-800-585-9396 is our toll-free number. If you've got a question for Colin about theology, church teaching, canon law, or, more importantly, if you have ever called on a day when you were told to call back on Friday and talk to Colin Donovan, today is your day, especially if maybe you're not available to call on Fridays, but you can call on Wednesdays. This is a unique opportunity for you to get Colin to answer your question at 1-800-585-9396, 1-800-585-9396. If you're outside the United States and Canada, your number is 1-205-271-2985, and we will put you straight to the front of the line at 1-271-2985, or you can send us an email, openline@ewtn.com. I was thrown off because our call screener, Mr. Matt Gubensky, just opened the phone lines as I was reading the other number, and I reverted back to the toll-free number, and look at this, 5 lines immediately full.
5 of his closest friends to
That's
make us feel good today as we fill in for the incomparable Father Mitch.
That's exactly right. And please keep Father Mitch in your prayers. He's doing well. We've seen him on campus a couple times this week already, but he is taking it slow and steady as he goes to make sure he's ready to roll when he comes back full speed ahead. Colin, we've got a couple emails that I think we'll tackle here.
Okay.
Well, I guess I should tell people who I am. I'm Jack Williams, for those of you who may not know. And now those of you who didn't want to know,
Can try to forget it.
you can make every effort to forget it. The producer is the lovely and talented Elena Rodriguez, spinning the dials behind the glass, and our call screener is Mr. Matt Gubensky. Got an email from Benjamin who says, I've struggled with my faith all my life, and as a result, I didn't go to confession for nearly 25 years or so. I felt completely scared at the idea of confessing all my sins, and they weighed heavily on me all the time, but I finally went a few months ago, and it was wonderfully joyous. However, I need help because I feel the same way still, and I'm really struggling to get myself to go again. I still struggle with things like lust, gluttony, and so on, and I know I need to go, and I want to, but it's like I hit a wall whenever it comes time for me to get in the car and go. What advice can you give me to help me overcome this mental barrier I seem to have that keeps me from going to confession? And I promise you, Benjamin is not the only one that has this question.
Yeah, I think it's easy, he's not saying and we're not asking, whether the struggles that he has amount to sin, because struggles don't necessarily amount to sin. In those particular areas that he talks about, lust and gluttony, there is certainly grave matter potentially, and if we fully embrace that. But if we're struggling against it, generally you might say God is on our side, and if we fail through weakness, it's much easier to confess and to start anew than it is if you've been living a malicious life, through your own self-will, through your own intention.
And in our society in particular, you don't have to beat around too many bushes to find temptation in those 2 areas in particular.
Exactly, in those 2 areas. So I would say this, first of all, provided he doesn't wait 25 more years, it's going to be easier than that time simply because of the necessity to examine your conscience over that 25 years to see where have I fallen in serious matter. So that won't be as difficult. The other thing is, if you do it more frequently, even if it's every month or every 2 months, or the seasons of Lent and Advent, say, to start, and then you ramp it up from there, like an athlete who does a few repetitions, and then he increases the repetitions, and the muscles get a little bit stronger, the endurance gets a little bit better, and it's like that here in the spiritual life too. So just start. And if you don't have any mortal sin, the areas that you mention are ones obviously where we can fool ourselves about mortal sin, and also where we need the assistance of grace. So a good devotional confession that concentrates on these particular areas, as opposed to trying to recall every potential venial sin that you committed, that would be very, very helpful. So I would say, just make it a point to go again. We're in the Easter season still. Maybe before the season is over, you may have already done your Lenten Easter season confession, but get it again. Pentecost is coming up, and then try for increased repetitions. And over time goes on to increase that into a nice, steady pace of devotional confessions, whether it's once a month or every 6 weeks. Whatever it works out is convenient and helpful to you.
Mary writes, I've been told by multiple professors that a spiritual director is important to leading a full Catholic life. My question is, what is a spiritual director, and what is their role?
A spiritual director is a person who helps one in the moral life and in the spiritual life, and making the distinction between the life by which I avoid sin or choose to sin, and what goes with that, the penitential life, the frequency of, self-imposed penances, fulfillment of duties and all of that. And then the spiritual life, as a person gets closer to the Lord, they may start receiving favors from the Lord. Maybe their prayer life is increasing, and then you certainly have a great need. For most of us, regular practice of confession deals with the moral side of it. We, as needed, we go and we go to confession, and we get the advice to conquer sin that is needed in the circumstances of that confession, and then we go again at some future date. But if people are serious about the spiritual life, then a spiritual director as a guide, somebody who is usually knowledgeable in the church's theology of prayer, and obviously moral theology is very helpful too, and perhaps already has some practice of that, is a good pious priest. So the knowledge part, there are many good priests out there. The knowledge part is the difficulty, and that's the reason that many have trouble finding a spiritual director. Somebody who will admit that, yes, I feel competent to do this task, and that my other responsibilities don't preclude me undertaking this responsibility. Because it's a free act by which, you approach a priest to be your spiritual director, and he receives you as his spiritual child for that purpose. And it's also free to leave. You feel that it's better to go somebody else, or he feels it is better that you go to somebody else. So it's a free relationship. And as St. Teresa of Avila always said, the most important thing is better to have a knowledgeable priest actually than a holy priest. And so if you can find somebody who is knowledgeable in growth in the moral life and growth in the spiritual life, such a person can be a good spiritual director. We often find, as many of the saints have found, it's difficult to find such a priest sometimes, in which case we throw ourselves on God's mercy and let him lead us and guide us. We read good spiritual books of individuals like Francis de Sales and the mystics themselves, like Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, who would help us. And so we make up as best we can the lack of a spiritual director. But if we can find one, it is a great help to the spiritual life.
Just getting started on an open line Wednesday. Our Vice President of Theology, Colin Donovan, sitting in for Father Mitch. 1-800-585-9396 is our toll-free number. If you get a busy signal, keep trying. We'll get through as many as we can during the hour. Open line Wednesday with Colin Donovan.
From EWTN News Nightly in Washington, D.C., I'm Brian Patrick with your EWTN Newslink. Donald Trump wins nearly all the delegates at stake in the West Virginia and Nebraska primaries. He now has 92% of the delegates needed for the Republican presidential nomination. Bernie Sanders vows to stay in the Democratic race after winning the West Virginia primary Tuesday. A trio of bombings in Baghdad kill at least 88 people and wound dozens more. The first attack, the most deadly, a car bomb exploded at a crowded market in a predominantly Shiite neighborhood of Baghdad. Utah's requirement that a baby in a womb receive anesthesia or painkillers before some abortions is now in effect. The law requires pain relief for the unborn baby before any abortion at 20 weeks of gestation or later. Pope Francis continues teaching on God's mercy today, using the familiar parable of the prodigal son at his Wednesday audience. He points out God doesn't barter, rewarding good and punishing bad. Watch News Nightly tonight.
How do you honor Mary during the month of May? Share your photos and stories with us. Email communications@EWTN.com and we'll post as many as possible on our social media sites.
This week on Register Radio, Jeanette DeMello and columnist Father Raymond D'Souza discuss at what cost the University of Notre Dame honors Vice President Joe Biden and former House Speaker John Boehner with the Letara Medal. Also, Jeanette and writer Marge Fenelon show how Marian devotion ties in with Catholic family life. Join Jeanette and me, Elena Rodriguez, for Register Radio this weekend on EWTN Radio.
Hello, this is Bishop Ronald Gaynor of the Diocese of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
This is Michael Warsaw, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of EWTN.
This is Father Mitch Pacwa. Thanks for listening to the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
This is Open Line on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. If you have a question or comment, call 1-800-585-9396. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985 or send an email to openline@ewtn.com.
Hey, be sure to check out our website at EWTN.com. All kinds of great information, including all of the information you'd ever want on Mother Angelica, the foundress of our network. That's EWTN.com. To the phones we go. Our leadoff hitter today is Richard in Hickory, North Carolina, listening to EWTN on Sirius XM Channel 130. Richard, you're on with Colin Donovan.
Good afternoon. Thank you for taking my call.
You're welcome.
I haven't heard much about people who are having a hard time getting annulments, that they can still receive the sacraments, especially communion and confession. And our priests, back in the fall when they said the Pope was changing his mind and having, easing up on some of the restrictions, and our priest said, as long as you remain chaste, and if you're having a hard time getting your annulment, you can still receive the sacraments. I haven't heard much said about that.
Well, that's an incomplete way of putting it, because the condition of scandal is one which the Pope himself mentions in that exhortation, and that's also the traditional canonical and moral theology condition. And that is, there's a difference between two people who are in that condition, who are well known to be divorced, not annulled, and living together as if married, and two people, say, who come into the parish from somewhere else, and that's their situation. In the latter case, if the priest gets the moral state in order, if a good confession gets their moral state in order, so that they, any sins associated with the separation and divorce, any sins associated with their living together as married when they are not in fact married, when all of that is confessed and the commitment is made that they will live as brother and sister, the confessor, the pastor, whoever could say that you are, as long as you are not a scandal, you could receive publicly Holy Communion. It's much different when everybody in the parish knows, because imagine you have a parish, a typical parish today in the United States, might have 1,500 families. 1,500 families, 4,000 or 5,000 people potentially in that parish. Once somebody who is known to be divorced and remarried starts going up publicly for Holy Communion, that becomes a public act, a statement that the Church's law, the Church's canonical process is irrelevant, and it will mislead people. That's what scandal is. Others, and the Pope mentions especially young people, will get the idea, oh, everything goes now. It's quite different when the couple are unknown. Everyone assumes they're married. They move into the parish. Maybe they've got 2 or 3 kids that come from their union. They get right with the Lord in confession. They come up, nothing has, as far as anybody is concerned, there is no scandal. So the element of scandal is important. Now, it could be possible, I presume, that even in the other case, with that resolution of the moral condition in the internal forum, that communion could be given privately to the persons. That would be a different, because there is no scandal there. Remember, the condition for receiving communion is to be in the state of grace. So couples who are divorced and living in a civil union can get to that moral state, but they can't receive communion through a public act because of the scandal. They're obliged to refrain from that because their good act would scandalize the weak people. This is a principle in St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians in chapter 8, where he talks about eating meat sacrificed to idols. He says, we are free. We have this great freedom, but we should not exercise our freedom, which will be a scandal to the weak. So that, not a pharisaical scandal of people who are, chatterboxes and critical and will be scandalized by everything that anyone does. That's not the kind of scandal we're talking about. We're talking about the scandal of the weak, that especially youth and children would be led to believe by a public reception of communion that John and Mary, who they know were previously married and did not get a decree of nullity, just freely go up and receive communion, and Father said it was all right. That's the scandal. So that would allow John and Mary to perhaps receive privately, where nobody except the pastor knows, and certainly soon, immediately after the confession would be a good time to do that, when it can be done, when this is resolved. Because clearly the danger of living together, even for the sake of children, could result in other moral faults, and that has to be considered. And then a new confession and a new commitment to live chastely has to be made. So the moral law didn't go out the window, and the Pope didn't say the moral law went out the window. Nor did he say, and he specifically said the opposite, that scandal shouldn't be considered. And so that has to be the criteria that priests use to make judgments in this area. Now, the Pope encouraged priests to get close to such couples, to help them walk along the path of discernment, to look at their past marital life and say, what went wrong, and am I the cause of what went wrong? And was I wrong in leaving? And even something be reconciled there? Those are questions that can be asked in the internal forum and need to be asked. But nowhere does the Pope say that the shackles are off and couples can go up willy-nilly regardless of their moral state and the publicly known status of their current marital situation. That is simply not true, and the Pope doesn't say it, and the moral law doesn't admit it anyway.
Does that make sense, Richard?
Yes, it does. I happen to fall into the latter, and my wife is having a hard time getting her annulment, but in the meantime, our priest told me as long as we remain chaste, and I went for years church. I still go daily if I can. And I haven't received the sacraments, but he said as long as you remain chaste, go to confession. He told me I can receive communion. And see, the part that he left out, which I really didn't understand, which I did now, thanks for the explanation, was the scandal part. And we live in another state from where we used to live, so as far as everybody knows that we are, we've been married a long time, we have a couple older children, but we are scandal-free. That's what.
You sound like exactly the kind of people the Pope and this is the traditional practice of the Church. The Pope didn't invent it. It's mentioned by John Paul II in Familiaris Consortio. It's mentioned in numerous ecclesiastical documents. It's certainly part of seminary training. So, you sound like the people. And for many others who can't receive in their own parish, well, maybe once a month they go to a parish where they're unknown to receive communion. Again, the judgment should be the one of the priest who reconciles you completely with the church in the sacrament, and not one that we take upon ourselves.
Hey, Richard, in this time of trial, in walking with the precepts of the church, have you found that this is increased?
Not broadcast loud. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Richard. Appreciate the phone call. 1-800-585-9396. And I was going to ask Richard if walking through this with the mind of the church during this trial has probably increased his own spirituality along the way.
Well, I would think so, because I think people are generally of goodwill, and they get into these situations obviously through some fault of their own. They make decisions, and they have to live with the consequences of those decisions. But the culture, catechesis is at fault. The culture is at fault. There's a lot of reasons which the Pope mentions specifically, the very complex situations that people find themselves in. They still must observe the moral law, but there is this possibility for some of them, and that can be explored in the process of that discernment.
Next up is Chantel. She's in Charleston, South Carolina, listening to EWTN on AM 730. Chantel, you're on with Colin Donovan.
Hi, thank you for taking my call.
You're welcome.
I am just hoping to get some clarity with the difference between Catholics. I was born and raised Catholic, and Episcopalian. I was just in a conversation with a friend of mine who's Episcopalian, and I was not able to have a clear answer, but basically she believes that they are also apostolic and that they have a valid Mass, and that we could interchangeably go to each other's services.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot packed into that. That is, in fact, that was the position of John Henry Newman as an Anglican priest. He believed what the Anglo-Catholic movement in the Church of England believed. You might call it the high churchers, who have a very sacramental Catholic-like, or some would say Catholic-light, approach to the sacraments. And the branch theory said, well, there's the Orthodox, there's the Catholics, and then there's the Church in England. And when St. Hilda encouraged at the Synod of Whitby the adopting of the Roman calendar and practices and so on, this is like in 600 and something, that England came under Rome's thumb, and Henry VIII, I guess you could say, liberated England to go back to its ancient patristic roots and its ancient self-governance, just as the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, and so on have self-governance. The only trouble is that doesn't hold up historically. Take the point of the sacraments. The Orthodox have holy orders. They have the 7 sacraments. The Anglican Church doesn't profess to have 7 sacraments. It depends also on which Anglican you talk to. Some have reconciliation, confession. When I lived in England, our neighbors were an older couple. They were obviously high church Anglicans because they would go to confession on some Saturdays. So some Anglicans do that. But the difficulty is that when Henry broke away and Catholic bishops and priests followed him because they wouldn't swear, they accepted the act of supremacy that he was head of the church in England. When they did that, you had Catholic sacraments. Then along came Edward VI and Elizabeth, and the view of the sacramental ministry became more Lutheran and Calvinist, more continental than the pre-existing Catholic theology, and they changed the ordination rites for the Anglican clergy to eliminate those popish things like sacrifice and priesthood and all of that. So when those Catholic bishops that lost the faith and joined Henry died, they ceased to ordain not only priests in England, but bishops obviously as well.
And Chantel, Colin will put a bow on this in just 1 second, and we've got plenty of time for your phone calls as well at 1-800-585-9396, toll-free anywhere in North America, 1-800-585-9396. 9396. Open line Wednesday. Colin Donovan sitting in for Father Mitch.
When you listen to Women of Grace Live, it's not possible to come away from that hour without feeling encouraged, without feeling inspired, without feeling that you've just had the opportunity to enter into holy conversation. This holy conversation comes by way of the many callers who share with us the concerns of their heart, the issues that they're facing. I'm Janet Benkovic, inviting you to join me weekday mornings at 11 Eastern for Women of Grace on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
All of our advances in social networking and communication are amazing, but if we don't keep it all in place, we might end up in touch with the news of the day, 1,000, quote, friends online, and 1 million work emails, but we lose touch with the most important things in life, like the people right in front of us, and God revealing Himself to us through the experiences of daily life. I know it's not easy, but you have to seize the silence. Carve out moments to unplug. Read a book, say a prayer, or just stand in the sun and take a deep breath. All the noise will be waiting for you when you're done, but you'll face it all a little differently. In the words of Mother Teresa, the fruit of silence is prayer. The fruit of prayer is faith. The fruit of faith is love. The fruit of love is service. And the fruit of service is peace. If you don't have peace, go back to step one. Got silence? This is Chris Stefanik from RealLifeCatholic.com on EWTN Radio.
Most men will do almost anything to avoid deep theological discussions. Well, you don't need a doctorate in theology to listen to and enjoy the Catholic Cafe. Join me, Deacon Jeff Drzymski, along with my trusty sidekick Tom Dorian, as we try and make manly sense out of living the Catholic faith.
The Catholic Cafe, Saturdays at 4 p.m. Eastern and Sundays at 5 a.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. Live truth, live Catholic.
Podcasts of Open Line are available within 24 hours of live broadcast. Go to EWTN.com and click on Multimedia.
This is Open Line on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. If you have a question or comment, call 1-800-585-9396. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985 or send an email to openline@ewtn.com.
Tonight, Father Joseph filling in for Father Mitch on EWTN Live. He'll talk to Father William Watson, and they'll talk about the Sacred Story Youth Program. That's tonight, 8 Eastern on EWTN Radio and television. We're talking with Chantel in Charleston, South Carolina. And Colin, you're illustrating kind of the distinctions between the Catholic Church and the Episcopalian Church and how they're not really as interchangeable as Chantel's friend would have her believe.
Right, and how the roots really go back to the 1500s when Henry broke away and the Church of England, the Anglican Church, was established. And then it became more Protestantized under his son Edward and his daughter Elizabeth, and the result of that was that the Church ceased to have valid ordination of bishops, and therefore also valid ordination of priests. And the prayers and so on that were put into the liturgy, especially by Cranmer, who was a Anglican bishop, those prayers removed all of the sacrificial language of the Mass and so on and so forth, and really Protestantized it. So within one generation, whatever validity there was to priesthood and sacraments in England died out, probably at least by the end of the 1500s, if not more towards the, 3/4 of the way through or so, you'd start to see that happening. Now, the effect on that is multiple, and one of the effects is that without an episcopacy, and of course this began with the break with the Holy Father, with the break with the Pope, who is the guarantee of doctrine? So not only in the Anglican Church do not have valid sacraments, save baptism, which anybody can perform, or marriage, which the couple themselves perform, but not orders, not confirmation, not reconciliation, not sacrament of the sick. But you also then, with the break with the Holy Father, who is the guarantee of union among the episcopacy and also of truth, of faith in the church, what do you see? You see an atomization of Christian faith in the Anglican Church. You see the different breakaway groups to the Reformed tradition, the Calvinist tradition. You see the Puritans. You even see civil war resulting from this religious mess that was created in the 1600s. And so you see the fracture of doctrine. In the 20th century, we certainly saw the fracture of moral doctrine in the Anglican Church with the approval of contraception for married couples, which is basically approval in general at that point, abortion, homosexuality, most of the major moral factors which guard the family and guard holiness in the family and between men and women, and with children as they grow up to become mature men and women, have been destroyed by the loss of doctrine and fidelity to doctrine. So now you've got the sacraments destroyed, you've got the faith destroyed, and you've got the hierarchical communion destroyed. And so you have the national churches like the Episcopal Church and the different names taken by the Church of Ireland and the Church this, here, and the other where. All of them are really, they call it the Anglican Communion, but it is such a large, disparate group of people with everything from very low Protestant church opinions to very high Catholic, that there is really no unity. There's certainly no unity of faith, no unity of sacraments. And there is a smidgen of unity of hierarchy, except that it's not a hierarchy because they don't have valid orders. So there's a tremendous difference between the Anglican Communion and all of the churches that make that up, and say the Orthodox Church, which has a valid episcopacy, has the valid doctrines which we share with them from the first millennium, although we have defined them more profoundly in the second millennium and now into the third, and has a communion that is a little bit more fractious than within the Catholic Church, because they have the autocephalous churches, where the head of the church in a particular country is the head, is the responsible person. And really the communion with the Patriarch of Constantinople is one of honor and nothing in really holding the faith, the doctrine, the sacraments of the church together. So in the end, the Catholic Church becomes a unique entity where there's a communion of charity among the bishops, there is a communion of faith in the doctrines which we hold in common, and a communion of sacraments in the celebration of the means of the redemption which is given to us. And in all of that, there is the variety of the Eastern rites and the non-Latin churches, but yet all in communion with the Holy Father as Christ intended. So there is no intercommunion between our churches. A Catholic, if they were in an Orthodox country and no Roman church was available, they could receive in an Orthodox church. They could go to confession in an Orthodox church if the Orthodox priest would permit it. You can't do that with the Anglican Church because they don't have a valid priesthood, they don't have valid sacraments, and therefore that which you hope to get from that experience you would not actually be getting.
Is that helpful, Chantel?
That was a lot of information.
That's why we have podcasts.
That's exactly right.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. We appreciate the phone call. 1-800-585-9396 is our toll-free number. And anybody who wants to revisit any of Colin's thorough answers can do so by visiting EWTNradio.net, and you can check out the podcast of today's show. The lovely and talented Elena Rodriguez will have that up within a matter of hours from the end of the broadcast. Next stop for us is Montgomery County, Maryland. Margaret is in Montgomery County listening on Guadalupe Radio. Margaret, you're on with Colin.
Hi, Colin.
Hey, Margaret. What's your question today here?
So I've heard several times from friends and others, and also a priest on a CD, say that my prayers today for someone who has already died can affect their decisions before they died, because God is outside of time and space. And I've never heard that theology before and wanted to check that out.
Yeah, I don't buy it. That's not a theology. There was a notable priest a number of years ago who said that.
Who apparently was on a CD.
Apparently was on a CD. But this is one thing I think there is no basis in Catholic theology for. Cardinal Ratzinger, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, one of the things he talked about was that history is taken seriously by the church. In other words, we can't go back and uncreate the original sin. If what you're saying were true, let us all take one day and pray our darndest, and like on a Star Trek episode, have everything get blurry all of a sudden, and then we come out of the blur and we're all back in paradise. That's not going to happen. Our actions have consequences. History is a serious matter. Popes are popes. Councils are councils. You can even say presidents are presidents. We live by the reality which God gives us providentially in the time that he gives us. A bit of a nod to Gandalf on that one in his little speech to Frodo, in the time that is given to us to do something, which just points to Tolkien's Catholicity showing through The Lord of the Rings. But anyway, so no, I don't accept that. We can have an effect in aveternity, that where the time which Aquinas said is constituted by purgatory, for example, in that we can make reparation for the sins of the souls in purgatory and apply indulgences to them and pray for their release and so on and so forth. That's quite different than going back to the time, before they died. What you would be arguing is that, or what he would be arguing is that the judgment that was rendered to them was somehow revocable, appealable, changeable. And yes, God is out of time, but we are bound by it, and so our actions are bound by it. And until we are with God in the beatific vision, we can't have that eternal effect. After all, what our prayers are don't actually have effect. They're an appeal to God on behalf of somebody. Now, God is free to take that into account, I suppose. But we don't know. It's not been revealed to us that he knows, and I think it's poorly grounded in theology to suggest that, somebody can be saved. There are many cases where, there was something I've heard this with regard to suicides. And Padre Pio, John Vianney, and a number of others who have counseled mothers who came to them about their son who committed suicide, and said that, and told them that before it had full effect, they repented, and they'll be in purgatory till the end of time, paying for that decision, but they repented. And flipping through the channels, there was some program about suicide or something like that. And they mentioned this very small numbers of survivors of people who have jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge. It was in the context of Canada and the euthanasia laws up there. Because they're up there, they say if people make this decision to have their life taken, they could revoke it. But let's say they made it in a bad time. They made it, they met all the legal criteria, the doctors carried it out. They could possibly have changed their mind if medicine had done something differently, if their psychological state had changed. And in that context, the story of some of the people who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge was mentioned. And only a few have survived. All of them, or virtually all of them that survived, said, I leapt. I knew I'd made a mistake. I'd made an irreversible decision. And by the grace of God, they survived, and it wasn't irreversible. So I think even in those kinds of hard cases, we throw ourselves on the court of divine mercy and hope that that was also the case, and is also the case of most suicides, where there's any possibility of, thought about what I did as it takes effect beyond my control. And I think that has to be our consolation. We can't hope to undo the judgment and the decision that person made.
Thanks so much, Margaret, for that phone call. We'll head now to Houston, Texas. Brandy's listening on the EWTN app. Brandy, you're on with Colin.
Hi there. I'm expecting my second child, and with my current one, I prayed to her guardian angel, and I just had a thought during this pregnancy. Do unborn children have guardian angels, or is that something that happens after birth?
According to many fathers of the church, it happens at baptism, although the more common opinion is that all born children have guardian angels, which leads one to conclude that the general opinion has been that the guardian angel of the mother suffices for the child until it's born. And so I think that's the more plausible opinion, actually. But the church is now sort of inferring that all human beings have a guardian angel and not just the baptized, as some of the church fathers suggested was the case. I think we're free to go with that opinion, but there would be no basis of saying that an unborn child has its own guardian angel.
Is that helpful, Brandy?
That is. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate the phone call. 1-800-585-9396 is our toll-free number. 1-800-585-9396. Our Vice President of Theology, Colin Donovan, sitting in for Father Metch on EWTN's Open Line Wednesday.
"60 Seconds with Father Mitch Pacwa."
The priest must approach the Word of God with a docile and prayerful heart, so that when we prepare our sermons, we're not just coming up with cutesy stories. Rather, we pray over the text. I especially love to pray over the text in the chapel before the Blessed Sacrament, because the Jesus about whom I'm reading is the same Jesus present in that sacrament, and I want him to speak to my heart. This is going to be very important so that the Word of God may penetrate the thoughts of a priest. They may penetrate his feelings, bring about a whole new outlook toward the world. We don't look at the world on the basis of the world's ideas and assumptions. My norm for Scripture does not come from the scholars. My norm for those of us in scholarship come from Scripture. And we must submit to the Word of God. That must be key here.
The people you know and trust are on EWTN.
Tomorrow on Open Line, Father Larry Richards takes all your calls on evangelization. 3 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
May is dedicated to our Blessed Mother. Visit EWTN's Facebook page to see the many ways EWTN viewers and listeners around the world are celebrating Mary's Month. #MayAltar.
This is Open Line on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. If you have a question or comment, call 1-800-585-9396. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985 or send an email to openline@ewtn.com.
Hey, be sure to keep it right here. Many of these EWTN-affiliated stations at 4 Eastern, right after we're finished. Cresta in the afternoon, 2 hours of insightful conversations with Al Cresta. He'll talk to Don Yeager, and he'll also talk to Mary Healy, who has written a series of books about where do I start with the various books of the Bible. Today they'll talk about 1 Corinthians. Those are outstanding conversations that Al has with Mary Healy. And then at 6 Eastern, Catholic Answers Live. Hour number 1, Jimmy Aiken will host an open forum, and then they'll have Tim Staples, the Director of Apologetics for Catholic Answers, for hour number 2. That starts at 6 Eastern time on many of these EWTN-affiliated radio stations. Back to the phones we go. Nadine is in Los Angeles, California. She's watching on YouTube. Hi, Nadine. What's your question today for Colin?
Hi. Thank you for taking my call.
You're welcome.
My question is, my children were raised Anglican, and my one daughter converted to Catholicism, and her husband told us in a conversation one day that Anglicans would not go to heaven because they're not through the church, the Holy Church, the Roman Church. Could you please speak to that?
Yeah, that's a wrong statement. It's not what the Catholic Church teaches. Just as a general matter, providing that baptism is done correctly and a person is baptized, The way that we will get into heaven is to die in the state of justice. In other words, to die in the state of grace. So all of those who are just, whether those before the incarnation, such as the patriarchs, although they didn't go to heaven, they had to wait till Christ, in a sense, opened the doors up at the ascension. Their salvation was held in abeyance, if you will, completion of it, until heaven was opened. But it was their justice, being a friend of God, which got them into heaven. So for the baptized non-Catholic, for the Orthodox who are not Catholics, but are obviously, they have the sacraments, they have a true hierarchy, priesthood, as I mentioned earlier, the situation is the same. Now, what do the Orthodox and the Catholics have that others who are baptized don't have? Well, for instance, a moral authority in the Pope and in the tradition of faith and morals held by the Church, which can give them certainty regarding what they are to do morally and otherwise. Sacraments, such as the sacrament of reconciliation, which takes away the sin, guilt of mortal sin committed after baptism. The Church has this. The Orthodox have this. The Anglican Church and the churches of the Anglican Communion do not, because they do not have a valid priesthood. Therefore, they can't validly take away sin. And which situation, the condition for being restored to justice after mortal sin is the same condition as for a Catholic who doesn't have access to a priest, say, who needs to go to confession, he's dying and can't, and that is to make a perfect act of contrition, which the Church defined as sorrow for our sin because it's an offense against the good God and not because he's going to send us to hell if we're not forgiven it. That would be selfish, whereas faith in God demands of us that we look upon his goodness, and that goodness, as shown by the redemption, is what saves us. And that possibility exists for all of the baptized who fall into sin. Now, those who don't avail themselves of confession can do it because they're a Catholic, and they say that's old stuff. The Church doesn't do that after Vatican II. They'd be wrong. Or they can do it because they've been taught a line about the Catholic Church, and for them, well, God forgives sin. I don't need any priest to do it for me, and they may be in good conscience about that, and may even have a holy death. So you can't judge how a person is going to die, although how they live is often a good way of, suggesting how also they're going to die. So that's the answer to your son-in-law's question. He has narrowly framed it to exclude things which the Church positively includes, and that's the goodwill of people following the truth as they know it, who are in the state of grace and are sorry for sin after they fall with the right motive, the motive of charity and love of God, and therefore who can be restored to justice despite not being a Catholic, or being a Catholic not having access to the sacrament of penance. And so there are many other excuses, if you will, of not truly believing what the Church says about itself, what we call invincible ignorance, or of impossibility of taking advantage of what the Church offers by some moral or physical impossibility, some obstacle that somebody else puts there and our own will doesn't put there. So there's a lot to it, and that's why the Church doesn't normally speak in these kinds of, black and white categories. The Church teaches outside the Church there is no salvation, precisely to impress upon those who come to the knowledge that the Church is that established by Christ and has the true faith and has all the means of the sacraments, all the means of the redemption, who has the insights and truth of the prayer life and the penitential life and all that is needed to conquer the world for the sake of Christ and all of that, to impress upon them that it is there present in the Catholic Church, but that their ignorance is excusing if it's real and not faked and feigned and otherwise, something of a lie. So there's a lot more to the answer to that question. And the best the best statement I have ever found that covers all the bases of this, or basis to use the baseball metaphor, is if you go on our website and you go to the faith menu and you scroll down to the expert forums, and then you go over with your mouse to the little menu that pops up, and you go to frequently asked questions, and you look under doctrinal questions for outside the church no salvation, there is a beautiful statement by Blessed Pius IX, who lived in the 1800s, explaining God's mercy, explaining the truths that the church teaches about herself and the obligations to embrace that when one knows that it's true, but also the variety of conditions and situations of people who, through life circumstances, do not know that, or having heard it maybe from a bad Catholic, are not inclined to believe it, and the what God in His mercy offers. And it is salvation for those who follow the light of God's grace. But you have the main thing. You have baptism, and that's the starting point. Keep that innocent garment innocent, and you will die, and you will die, that's a certainty, and you will go to heaven if you keep it innocent.
Does that clear it up, Nadine, a little?
It's been very informative. Thank you. Both of you have a nice day.
You too. Appreciate the phone call. 1-800-585-9396 is our toll-free number. We'll go to Ray in Tempe, Arizona, listening on Sirius XM Channel 130. Ray, we've got about a minute left with Colin.
Great. What I wanted to ask about was this. I'm was a fall-away Catholic for many years, got back to really strong into apologetics. I'm the guy you call when people know the Jehovah's Witness or the Mormons are coming over, that kind of thing. But there's something that has stumped me from a lot of Catholics now are coming to me and saying, hey, I'm on my second step to get out of jail free type card. Something that Pope Francis just declared, that if you follow these 3 steps, you don't go to purgatory. It's kind of an indulgence thing. I'm trying to figure out what it is they're talking about. And what
Do you have any idea, Colin, what that might be?
I have no idea, and you've told me enough to say that's a bunch of hooey. Yeah, I don't know what they're talking about unless they're distilling something out of the apostolic exhortation and misunderstanding it, as so many people do, And that I addressed at the beginning of the show in regard of another question. And we also addressed on our EWTN Theology Roundtable last week, whose podcast you can get on our website.
Colin, thanks so much for filling in for Father Mitch and doing double duty. You did such a good job. We're going to have you back on Friday.
Oh, thanks, Jack. I appreciate that.
Well, I'm going to give the phone number out with 30 seconds left in the program. How am I doing? On behalf of our host, Colin Donovan, producer Elena Rodriguez, call screener Matt Kubensky, I'm Jack Williams. Thanks so much for taking some time out of your day. Back at it again tomorrow, Open Line Thursday with Father Larry Richards. Until then, God bless.